I don't want to be inspired by Star Wars. I want to be inspired by the things that inspired George. These are the words of Mandalorian co-creator Jon Favreau, and he is referring to the things often forgotten or dismissed by Star Wars audiences, either because they're too young for it to have had any influence on them, or simply because they don't care where something they love came from, they're just happy it's here. Favreau is referring to the old Saturday matinee serials, classic sci-fi, and most importantly, Japanese cinema. Welcome to this series where I will be looking at the themes and influences of The Mandalorian, and hopefully in doing so address some of the complaints it often faces from its critics. And while no show is above criticism, and The Mandalorian certainly has things to criticise within it, I believe its most vocal critics, at least those of which are fans, much like the detractors of the prequels before them, are missing the forest for the trees. Or in many cases, wanting something other than the forest in front of them and are mistaking the absence of what they want for poor quality. So let's begin with The Mandalorian's biggest influence. A beautiful, yet brutal work of art by writer Kazuo Koike and artist Goseki Kojima, Kozure Okami, known in English as Lone Wolf and Cub. On the face of it, Lone Wolf and Cub is a very simple story about an assassin named Ogami Itto, who is framed for a crime by his enemies, and as a result, his wife is killed, and he ends up on the run, travelling from place to place, taking sword-for-hire jobs with his son, Daigoro. This was also adapted into a TV series and a 6-part movie series, which is what many Western audiences will be familiar with. It is a story in the Jidaigeki genre, translating into historical play, or period drama as we might call it, though this genre is heavily defined by its connection to the Edo era. And yes, this is where the word Jedi comes from. The samurai influences of Star Wars are something that even the most casual of fans can pick up on, and Favreau wanted to go back to that samurai cinema that inspired Lucas and landed on something more modern, but very much cut from the same cloth. The visual similarities in what The Mandalorian borrows from its Japanese predecessor are striking. The image of Ogami Itto pushing that pram through the elements is an image iconic in Japanese media. Similarly, the image of Grogu trailing alongside Mando in his little hover pram has cemented itself in the minds of people, many of whom had no previous interest in Star Wars. The lone samurai travels from place to place, and along the way he meets people living their lives in a very dangerous and transitional period in history. Every place has different people with different problems and different outlooks on life. This kind of tale lends itself well to an episodic format. And that brings us to our first criticism. It is uncompelling, because it's just taking characters from place to place all over the galaxy, when what we really wanted was world expansion in the form of perhaps remnant empire exploration. Styles differ from place to place and evolve as time goes on. With the advent of streaming services, especially in Western countries, the art of the episodic show has fallen by the wayside. They certainly still exist, but it is not the way most people enjoy television anymore. It is understandable, as an airing schedule means you will have to wait a length of time between episodes, and that calls for a different writing style than the more modern TV shows that appear more as if they were written as one large story that has been broken up into parts. Of course, shows like these did exist in the past. They are not a creation of streaming services, but mostly they were confined to genres like mystery or slice-of-life dramas. Episodic television shows did have overarching plot lines, but they were usually the secondary focus of each individual episode, where the character would be presented with a problem to be resolved in that episode and that episode alone, and meet characters confined to that episode and that episode alone. This format could appear repetitive if watched in one go, but it is specifically designed to be consumed at a more laid-back pace. The Mandalorian is a show that is, at least in its first season and a decent chunk of its second one, designed in the format of old-fashioned TV. The overarching story is, a lone warrior goes back on his contract to save the life of a child he had been paid to deliver into less than kind hands. As a result, he ends up on the run from these enemies, going from place to place hiding from them, along the way encountering different problems and meeting different people. Both Mandalorian and Lone Wolf and Cub take place in a dangerous transitional period in their respective histories. We see through the characters they meet on their travels how different people cope with uncertain times. Some try to carve out little corners for themselves. Some are trying to usher in a new future heedless of those who don't want it. Some are on the run from the past, and some are trying to bring the past back. It is through these encounters that we learn about the world in such a way that does not make the battle of gods and kings its focus, but instead focuses on how little people cope with the changes and destruction those gods and kings leave in their wake. This kind of world building also tells us a lot about the character exposed to it. Din Djarin, too, is a victim of this destruction. This has led him and his people who lost their homeworld to retreat inward and cling to the only thing they could salvage from the wreckage, what they believed. Concerns beyond that are non-existent. Din, through his travels, learns more and more about the galaxy around him and begins to question his outlook on life, whereas Ogami Itto inversely clings to his ways, as they are the only things keeping him alive. But most importantly, these two characters' journeys are defined by their connection to the one they're sharing it with. Both properties focus on the relationship between the wandering Ronin and his infant travelling companion. This is where we see how the values and beliefs of each character affect how they interact with their children. We will be exploring the theme of fatherhood in a later video, but it's important to remember how one's environment, values, and moral standards influence how children are raised. Many Western audiences found Ogami Itto an infinitely cold character, and they are right, he is, even by the standards of his environment. But many have taken that to mean that he is heartless, and it goes to show how little attempt at understanding is made sometimes when it comes to understanding the mindset of a person who was raised with such a different set of values than your own. Which is another thing we'll encounter in this series. There are perfectly normal, loving Japanese parents even today that don't hug their children. So if we look at this from Ogami Itto's point of view and take into consideration Japanese values, we start to understand a little more why he behaves the way he does. And the quiet moments show the deepening bond between father and son. The Mandalorian, by contrast, seems much more comfortable with children, even if in the beginning he has things to learn, perhaps owing to differing value sets in the character, the writer, and the audience. But ultimately, The Mandalorian, like its influence, is the story of a man and child on the run, surviving however they can, and becoming shaped by the people and places they encounter. In both stories, the children are given a choice. Choose the sword and stay, or choose the comforting item and leave. Both scenes have very important differences and similarities. Both are being told that if you choose the sword, you will live by the sword. You may never be reunited with that which comforts you again. Or, forsake the way of the sword, and return to the loving arms of a parent who is gone. The children each make simultaneously a different choice and the same one. Daigoro chooses the sword, and it is made clear that this choice is going to be like a journey into the many circles of hell. Grogu chooses the gift of armor, something protective, and to the people who make and revere it, comforting. But the most important thing, the thing that any audience should take away from these scenes, both children choose their father.